afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Rachel Heisler. We're here with the Campaign to Fix the Debt in Washington, D.C. I'm going to quickly turn the call webinar over to Dave Walker, the former U.S. Comptroller General of the United States and currently a senior advisor at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Dave, come in.
Thank you, Rachel, very much. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. I've been asked to provide an overview perspective of federal and state fiscal challenges and some of the potential implications for the future. And obviously, we look forward to receiving your questions. So why don't I take about 10, 15 minutes maximum to cover some material. We have some slides that will help you follow along, and then we'll end up providing plenty of time for you to ask questions. Let's start off with the first slide, and let me say something provocative at the beginning. The federal government has grown too big, promised too much, is subsidizing too many, and needs to restructure. It's spending too much on consumption, not enough on investment. It faces serious future debt challenges that we've got to come to grips with in order to create a better future for our country, for our children, for our grandchildren, and future generations. In addition, a number of states and localities face serious challenges as well. And as we all know from Isaac Newton and gravity, bad news flows downhill. So when the federal government restructures, that bad news will have a ripple effect down to the state and localities. A typical state relies upon the federal government for 35% of its finances. Localities rely upon the states. And so we're all in this together. And we need to recognize reality. We need to capitalize on our strengths. We need to address our challenges. And we need to do it sooner rather than later. So let's start off with some evidential matter to back up some of the things that I said. In 1912, which is a little over 100 years ago, the federal government was only 2% of the U.S. economy. And that's really the way you need to look at the size of government. How much does it spend as a percentage of the pie? In 2015, the federal government was 20% of the U.S. economy. So basically 10 times bigger between 1912 and 2015. Now, you and I both know that the United States is, has a different position in the world today. The world is a different place than it was in 1912. But the bottom line is we're 10 times bigger and we're projected to grow even larger. More disturbing is the next slide, which shows that irrespective of the size of the federal government, the Congress has lost control of the budget. In 1912, the Congress controlled 97% of federal spending. The only thing that it didn't control was interest. And back then, we didn't have the Federal Reserve, so we couldn't manipulate interest rates. We had to play market rates. But if you look in 2015, you'll see that 68% of the federal budget is on autopilot. We're writing a blank check for 68%. We're only controlling 32%, and that 32% is going down as we project into the future. If you look at the next slide, you'll see what's happened with regard to deficits in recent years and what's projected to happen in the future. Yes, deficits are down significantly from the peak in fiscal 2009 of $1.4 trillion, but we're now headed up. And they're expected to rise in the future, due in large part because of known demographic trends and rising healthcare costs. And what's the fastest growing expense in the federal budget, according to the Congressional Budget Office? Interest. Interest on the federal debt. And what do we get for interest? Nothing. So let's look at the next graphic. This is what really matters. A lot of people talk about deficits. A lot of people talk about debt. What we really need to focus on like a laser is how much debt do we have as a percentage of the economy. Not all debt is bad. Some debt is necessary. Some debt is prudent when we're making investments to create a better future. But too much debt is not good, especially when that debt relates to paying for current consumption or relates to creating an interest burden that crowds out other federal spending and opportunities to be able to create a better future. The truth is, with the sole exception of right after World War II and today, the United States has generally not had federal public debt to GDP levels in excess of 35 to 40%, except right after World War II and today. And if you're honest about the accounting, our debt to GDP today is not 75%. You have to count what we owe Social Security and Medicare, what's in their so-called trust funds, which is nothing more than federal debt. That's about 30% of GDP. So if you want to consider that, it's really about 105%. What's more important is it's moving up. And various economists have done studies saying that too much debt has a drag on economic growth, creates uncertainty with regard to the private sector, with regard to investment, and clearly we're experiencing that at the present point in time. People know that we've got to make tough choices. The question is when, how, and how would we phase it in. The next graphic will end up demonstrating that, we have a lot of obligations that frankly aren't on the balance sheet. They're off the balance sheet. Believe it or not, the several $1 trillion that we owe Social Security and Medicare trust funds is not on the balance sheet. And furthermore, we've got tens of trillions of dollars of unfunded Social Security and Medicare obligations that are not on the balance sheet. And so you hear about $19.4 trillion in debt subject to the debt ceiling limit. Frankly, when you count unfunded civilian and military pensions, retiree health care, a range of other commitments and contingencies, and unfunded Social Security and Medicare benefits, the real number is at a minimum $65 trillion, depending upon what time horizon you use and what discount assumptions you use. The next graphic will turn to the states. Look, the bottom line is this. We are going to restructure at the federal level. The question is when and how and over what time frame. But the bottom line is the federal government will end up taxing somewhat more than historically has been the case, and it will end up spending significantly less than it's projected to spend. The sooner we get started, the better, so we can get the miracle of compounding working for us rather than against us. And as I said before, the law of gravity says bad news flows downhill. So let's look at the states. This is a study that was done by PricewaterhouseCoopers Public Sector, of which I'm affiliated, where we basically rank the financial position and the competitive posture of the 50 states. Now let me try to explain this quickly. In this one graphic, you'll see that there are 11 states that have a positive net financial position. And that net financial position is how much in net positive financial assets does it have as a percentage of median household income. So we're basically looking at what's the number per taxpayer, which is roughly equal to number of households. We're comparing that number to median household income to give you a ratio. And you will see that Alaska has a positive net financial position of 77.3% of median household income in Alaska. And 11 states have positive numbers. 39 states have negative numbers. And the worst is Illinois. Illinois has total liabilities and unfunded promises equal to about 81.9% of median household income. You ought to look and see where your state stands. The next item in brackets talks about what's the relative competitive posture of the state. If it's number 1, that means it's in the top tier, the top 10 for competitiveness. If it's number 5, it means it's in the bottom tier, the bottom 10 in competitiveness. And why does this matter? Because this has to do with how competitive are you with other states, and therefore to what extent do you have an ability to be able to grow your economy and tax base faster than the budget, which is key. Unfortunately, when you look at this, you'll see that most of the states that are in bad financial condition also have poor competitive posture. There's other information in this report which you can access through the website of the link that's noted on this table, where you can find out what net migration patterns are. Which ones of these states are already experiencing net outflows of population. Unfortunately, a lot of the challenged states are in that category already. You can also ascertain how much of this is attributable to underfunded pensions and unfunded retiree health obligations. Typically, about 70 to 80% is attributable to that. And so I would encourage you to take a look, find out not just where the federal government is, find out where your state is, and then also your locality. Because ultimately, this challenge is cross-border. We've got outdated tax systems, we've got excessive regulatory burdens, unfunded retirement obligations, escalating healthcare costs, expensive and yet ineffective welfare systems, deteriorating critical infrastructure, and increasing intergovernmental dependency, both within government and between levels of government, domestically and internationally. So what's the bottom line? We have current unsustainable fiscal policies at the federal level and also in many states and localities. These are going to have to be addressed with. There's a number of common denominators between these, which I've touched on. We're going to need strong CEO leadership from the president, the governor, the mayors, the heads of county commissions, et cetera, to be able to deal with this. We need nonpartisan solutions that can gain bipartisan support. We need very conspicuous public engagement to lay out the facts, tell the truth, talk about the tough choices, bring people together on a shared goal based on principles and values that will bring people together rather than divide them apart, and then come up with those nonpartisan solutions that can get bipartisan support, and then negotiate on a private basis with the legislative bodies and other bodies necessary to make these things a reality. Eventually, the federal reforms will flow downhill. States and localities need to get ahead of that and be ahead of that downdraft. It's not too late to create a better future. Absolutely, it's not too late. But we need to get started soon. It's going to take patience, persistence, perseverance, and pain before we prevail. But prevail we must, prevail we can, and prevail we will if we all work together. Thank you very much, and let's see if you've got any questions.
Thanks, Dave. If you have a question, please type it into the text box. And please include your first and last name and where you're from. Why don't we start from an internal question here? Dave, what specifically can an executive, a president, or a governor do to show leadership and drive change on this issue?
Well, when you're the CEO, meaning president, governor, or mayor, you have the bully pulpit, as Theodore Roosevelt used to refer to it. You have the ability to command media attention, and it's important that you take advantage of that. Legislative bodies are very important. They have a key role to play with regard to trying to help deal with a lot of these reforms. At the same point in time, they're committees. You can't run a country, a state, or a locality by committee. And so you need to have a CEO who believes that this is a challenge that needs to be met, who's willing to spend time and energy and political capital to try to get it done, who will engage the public directly, honestly, in a constructive fashion along the lines that I've talked about, and then we'll negotiate privately on a bipartisan basis to try to help achieve the needed reforms, being informed by what they hear from the American people. Frankly, all too frequently what happens in Washington and many state capitals is people who are the elected leaders try to tell the public what needs to be done, or frankly, in many cases, won't even admit that something needs to be done. We need to tap the wisdom of the American people. They are ahead of the politicians in many regards. They know we have a problem. They're willing to accept tough choices. Yet they're part of a comprehensive, goal-oriented plan consistent with principles and values that bring people together rather than divide people apart. So leadership. Leadership is the biggest deficit this country has, and the CEOs have the ultimate responsibility, but they'll need help from others.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Our first question from participants is Alex in Tampa, Florida. And his question or statement, and if you want to shed some light on it, is he's disappointed that the media doesn't cover the national debt issue to the extent that it should. What are your thoughts on that, Dave?
Well, first, the media has been hollowed out. There's not nearly as many people in the traditional media as there used to be. Secondly, they're not making as much investment in the area of investigative reporting that they used to. Thirdly, frankly, some of the issues that we talk about are fairly complex, and it takes time for people to try to be able to understand this. Frankly, I'm not surprised that we didn't get a lot of attention on these issues in the primary. I'm hopeful that the media will step up to the plate, along with other interested parties, including all of us, to be able to ask some of the tough questions of those who are representing us and those who seek to represent us as to what are their thoughts and what's their way forward. They're not going to give us a lot of details, but what we can do at a minimum is to try to see if we can get them to agree that there is a problem, that they'll make it a priority, and that they recognize you can't grow your way out of this problem, you can't tax your way out of this problem, you can't cut this way out of this problem. Everything needs to be on the table, and we need to do it sooner rather than later.
Thanks, Dave. Our next question is from Chuck Reed, the former mayor of San Jose, California, with the Retirement Security Initiative. And he's complimented you and your work and was curious as to whether or not you will look at cities next.
Well, I do expect that we'll look at cities on a selective basis. I can tell you that I live in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which I would argue may be ground zero of fiscal irresponsibility in America. And as you know, Bridgeport is also in the state of Connecticut. When you look at the list, is number 47 out of 50 with regard to relative financial position, and is in the bottom tier with regard to competitive posture, and is also a net outbound state. Candidly, I have encouraged my mayor, I've encouraged my governor to try to be able to take these issues on, and so far they've been unwilling to do so. So I think we will take a look at cities, but it's going to have to be in a much more selective basis because there are many more cities and municipalities than 50, which is a more manageable number.
Thanks, Dave. Our next question comes from Krista Jones, who's a legislative assistant in Michigan, and she wanted background on what legally states can do to resist federal mandates that are tied to funding for education and healthcare or other major policy directives.
Well, one of the things that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to reconsider what's the proper role of government and what level of government is best able to execute on that role of government. The other thing that I didn't have a slide on, but it's very true, is if you look at what's happened since 1912, states' rights have been eviscerated. And the federal government has assumed more and more responsibility for things that, frankly, could be executed much more economically, much more efficiently, and much more effectively at the state and local level. And the truth is, it's been a couple of decades or more before we've had a very effective intergovernmental type of mechanism to be able to work with state and local governments and the federal government to try to figure out what needs to be done and to make sure that it gets done. And so I think hopefully what we'll see in the future is, as part of this effort to figure out how to put federal government finance together, is to also think about, well, what should be devolved? What should be devolved back to the states to give the states somewhat more flexibility with accountability, to be able to give the states some resources, but with flexibility to experiment and to reduce the number of federal mandates. Because the worst of all worlds is where you're given more mandates and less flexibility and more accountability and less resources. That dog don't hunt, as they say in Texas, and ultimately we're going to have to recognize that reality.
Thanks, Dave. Another question I just got via email is, can you cite any positive case studies of states that have had success in turning around their finances? And as a reminder, if you're interested in submitting a question, please click on the text box, identify where you're from, and we will read your question out loud. Go ahead, Dave.
Well, I think if you look at this list, okay, you'll see that there are a number of states that are in strong financial condition, and I would point to a couple. One is Indiana. Indiana's in the Midwest. It's a heartland of America. It's had Republican governors. It's had Democratic governors. And it has improved its financial position over the years. It's improved its competitive posture. So I think Indiana's a good case. Some people would say, well, look, if you look at all these states, how do you divide these states in between so-called red states and blue states? And you'll find that, the red states tend to be in better position, but in part because they tend to not have as an expansive role for the government. They also tend to be where the economy is growing more, rather than a lot of the blue states, the economy is not growing as fast, and they have more legacy obligations. At the same point in time, there's a clear exception. Look at Oregon. Oregon's clearly a blue state. There's no question about it. And yet, Oregon ranks highly. And so it really has to do with, recognizing that you've got to grow the tax base faster than the budget, and you shouldn't promise more than you can afford to deliver, and that if you make a promise, you need to make sure it's a promise that you actually fund. There's some fairly basic principles that we need to follow, and some states, frankly, are better at than others. So I'm going to say one last thing. 49 of 50 states have balanced budget requirements. Very few states have balanced budgets based upon a credible definition of a balanced budget. Because what happens is they balance their budget based on cash flows, they can accelerate revenues, defer expenses. Some states, including my own home state of Connecticut, have the audacity to borrow money at above market rates to be able to get bond premiums that can be used for current expenditures. And if they have money left over because they borrowed too much money, they call that a surplus. Try that down at your bank sometime.
Our next question comes from Bob, and he said, when you compare the debt as a percentage of GDP with other countries, are they comparable given that we have so many unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare? For example, Japan has a high debt to GDP ratio. Do their reported numbers include retirement and healthcare obligations?
Well, what we have done, and when I would say we, the Comeback America Initiative, which I headed, and Mike Murphy, who's Chief of Staff here at the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, was also involved with. We did a comparison of 34 OECD countries back in 2011, 2012, looking at debt to GDP based upon the traditional metrics. The traditional metrics are public debt to GDP, not considering trust funds, but then looking at it not just today, but over time, recognizing that that's the real metric we need to focus on, debt to GDP. Different countries have different levels of debt tolerance as a percentage of GDP based upon the size of the economy, the diversity of the economy, and a variety of other factors. And the bottom line is, of the 34 countries that we evaluated, number one in the world at 2012 was Australia, number 34 was Greece, and the U.S. was 26. Now I'm at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I've talked to our leadership about the possibility of us being able to pick up the mantle on this and coming up with a new rating, a more current rating, using that methodology with possibly some revisions, and we'll see where we stand. But the bottom line is we're below average with regard to our fiscal sustainability based upon our current path. We can, we must, and I expect eventually we will do better.
Our next question is from Andrew Cloyd, a recent college graduate with a Washington internship for students of engineering. His question is, you mentioned that there will be pain moving forward, something all elected officials wish to avoid for their constituents. What will catalyze legislators to bring upon this necessary pain despite the potential backlash from their voter base, endangering their prospects for re-election?
Well, first, congratulations on graduating, and secondly, congratulations on being an engineering major. We need a lot more engineering majors in the United States. Okay, the bottom line is you have to make the political price of doing nothing greater than the political price of making tough choices designed to create a better future for America, for our children, for our grandchildren, and future generations. One of the things that I get upset about is our current policies are irresponsible, unethical, and I would argue immoral. I got married at 19. My wife and I have been married 45 years. We have 2 grown children and 3 grandchildren. And a lot of the things that are being done today, my grandchildren are going to have to bear that burden. That's not right because they can't vote. What we have to do is, again, as I said before, we need a leader who will go to the American people, take the facts, speak the truth, talk about the tough choices, do all that I said, all right? We need to get the American people to be able to let their voice be heard so that we can create an environment where the price of doing nothing or continuing to kick the can down the road will be unacceptable. That's what we need to do. It's time to get on with it.
Our next question came in via email from Gary Zimmerman, who's the Chief of Staff at the Colorado Department of State. What are your thoughts, Dave, on a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution?
I do not support a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, but I strongly support a fiscal responsibility amendment to the U.S. Constitution, one that is focused on debt as a percentage of the economy. There are various groups that are trying to achieve what's called an Article 5 convention for a fiscal responsibility amendment. Under Article 5, the states have the right to assert themselves if the federal government ever becomes so dysfunctional that it doesn't do the right thing. Frankly, I think we're there. 28 of 34 states have already passed such a resolution. 6 more are necessary. And what I advocate for is an amendment that would focus on debt as a percent of the economy to be able to get our current level of public debt to GDP down to a reasonable and sustainable level by 2035. Let's say to get it from 75 down to 60. That's going to require that everything be on the table, but it's also going to require that we adopt pro-growth policies, whether it be with regard to tax policy, regulatory policy, devolution approaches. I think it's important that we do that because what matters is we need to grow the economy faster than the debt. We don't need to balance the budget, but we have to be able to reduce the related debt burden. And we cannot continue to have deficits and accumulate debt in peacetime when we're growing the economy. It's one thing when it happens when you're at war, you have foreign conflicts, or you're in a recession. But when you're doing it all the time, and it's only a matter of the magnitude of how much you're doing it, that's clearly unacceptable. That's clearly unsustainable.
We're going to take a question now from Vito Barberi, a state legislator from Idaho. His comments: the primary issue is pain. Legislators will not forego federal money no matter what the ramifications. Educators, state agencies, healthcare providers are not okay with any reduction in budgets in
Military spending?
I assume, for continued increases in budgets. Looking at realities such as these, a crisis is the only way to get their attention. How can we avoid a crisis?
Well, first, congratulations that you're in Idaho, because Idaho is ranked number 7 on the state relative financial position index. You're also on the second tier on competitiveness, so you're in pretty good shape. Look, the bottom line is this: we're going to confront this, and we're going to make the tough choices. The only question is, are we going to wait for a crisis where we have to do it without adequate due diligence in a crisis management fashion, where we have to do draconian things and we don't have time to educate people and phase it in? Or are we going to have committed, inspired, inspirational leadership, engage the American people with the facts, the truth, the tough choices, and the way forward, make those tough choices, phasing them in over time, which is a preferred way that will reduce the chances of a crisis and hopefully eliminate the chances of a crisis. I prefer number 2. But for number 2 to happen, you have to have a CEO who's willing to do what I said before, and you've got to engage the American people in ways that most politicians don't. We can do it, but it involves leadership, and it involves engaging the public in ways that has not historically occurred by elected officials.
Okay, this one's from Max, and this is going to be our last question. Dave, are you personally upset that the Republicans in Congress are not reducing federal spending? This question comes from a Republican legislator who is also upset that some Republicans in our legislature will not reduce spending.
What I'm concerned about is that we have no credible plan to put our finances in order that will get debt as a percentage of the economy down to a reasonable and sustainable level. And let me restate what that will require. It will require comprehensive tax reform that will make our system simpler, fairer, more competitive, and will generate more revenues 2 ways: through additional economic growth, through getting more people to pay something, and through getting the wealthy to pay a higher effective tax rate, to reduce the burdens on the middle class, which is the backbone of this country. We're going to have to reform social insurance programs to make them solvent, sustainable, and secure. But we're going to have to rationalize defense spending based upon credible current and future threats. We're going to have to separate the wheat from the chaff between which federal programs and tax policies are working and which ones aren't working. We're going to have to do a number of things that will result in significant reductions in projected spending as compared to the status quo. So I'm more concerned without having a plan, without having a comprehensive and credible approach to focus on what we have to focus on, and that's debt as a percentage of the economy.
Dave, thank you so much. I'm going to follow up with everybody who was on today's call with a copy of the slide and a link to the presentation if they'd like to share it with any of their friends and colleagues. And thanks to everybody for joining us. And Dave, thank you so much again for being here today.
Thanks, Rachel. Good to be
Thank you.
here. Thanks all of you for tuning in. Share